So here we are on day 3.5 of our retreat. I think Pat said the other day that even though we're in silence, each retreat sort of forms a community, and I think we had a community for the weekend, and then it changed yesterday. It certainly felt to me today that this smaller community was really happening, and there's really good energy, and it's just really a wonderful thing to share with everybody. My talk tonight is also, as was Sharon's last night, going to be about suffering. I'm going to pick up somewhat where she left off and take it in a slightly different direction. The title of my talk is The Gift of Suffering, and I hope to make the case tonight for that, for how suffering can be a gift in our lives if we let it, if we allow it to be, if we don't try to push it away or get rid of it. I often have non-Buddhists say to me, you know, that Buddhism, it's just about suffering. It's just such a downer. You know, what's up with that? In most other faith traditions, many of the other faith traditions with which I'm familiar, they address suffering by promising a better life in the next life. So suffer now, and then you get your payoff when you either go to heaven or get reincarnated or whatever the particular outcome might be. To me, one of the great things about Buddhism is that, and the Buddha's teachings, is that it acknowledges the suffering in this lifetime. But it doesn't just acknowledge it. It gives us a path out of suffering, a very clear path. So if one were to say, gosh, those Four Noble Truths are so pessimistic, I would argue quite the contrary. I think they're incredibly optimistic and incredibly hopeful. This is from the Buddha, from the Middle-length Discourses. He says, this is about the first noble truth of suffering. He says, now this, monks, is the noble truth of dukkha. Birth is dukkha. Aging is dukkha. Death is dukkha. Sorrow, lamentation, pain, grief, and despair are dukkha. Association with the unbeloved is dukkha. Separation from the loved is dukkha. Not getting what is wanted is dukkha. In short, the 5 clinging aggregates are dukkha. And I think Sharon mentioned these, but I'll just run through them. I'm not going to elaborate on them. But those 5 aggregates are material form, feelings, perceptions, mental formations, and consciousness. And that's a whole other talk. So the Buddha taught not to have us suffer, but to point a way out of suffering. And to me, that's really the beauty of his teachings. This is from Thanissaro Bhikkhu, who is a Buddhist monk. He says, but in addition to pointing out the truth of suffering, the Buddha also taught the path to the end of suffering. This too is a truth. The Buddha has guaranteed that when we develop it in full measure, we'll gain release from stress and suffering. It's not the case that suffering is the only truth, that we have to lie buried in stress and suffering. The Buddha found a way out of suffering, like an intelligent doctor who not only understands diseases, but also knows a miraculous medicine to cure them. So I would argue that suffering, as we encounter it in our lives, and we certainly do, can be a really wonderful teacher on our path. Typically what we do is we try to ignore it, cover it up, avoid it, deny it, put our head in the sand. We may, run too much, spend too much, eat too much, smoke too much, drink too much, work too much, all the gazillion ways in which we try to push the suffering away or avoid the experience of suffering in our lives or cover it up or deny it. But obviously that's not a path for coming out of suffering. It just keeps it going. Suffering's always in the background. We're just trying to avoid it. We're trying to run away from it. we certainly have no problem, most of us, I think, when things are going well, when things are pleasurable. We welcome the 10,000 joys, but we don't want much to do with the 10,000 sorrows. Can we just get half of that deal? So how is suffering a good teacher? Well, I would say, for starters, is because it calls out for our attention. It's like a toothache. You can't really ignore it. If you really lean into it, acknowledge it, it's hurting. You really have to address it. And it's essentially a wake-up call. It's telling us, you need to deal with this, and not in a maladaptive way of the ways I just spoke of. Sharon said last night that dukkha is not just the obvious forms of suffering, the gross forms of suffering, if you will, but all the more subtle dissatisfactions that our lives are filled with. And I think that's probably implicit in the Buddha's teachings, as and in the quote from the Pali Canon is all the ways in which suffering is in our lives. You may know this quote from Oscar Wilde. He says, "There are only two tragedies in life. One is not getting what one wants, and the other is getting it." Now, it's obvious that we suffer when we don't get what we want, and he speaks to that. But what is the tragedy about getting what we want? What is he really talking about? And I thought about that, and it seems to me that whether he intended or not, he's really pointing to impermanence. He's really saying, you can get this shiny new car, but in a couple of weeks, the novelty's worn off, and you're going to have to move on and try something different. So you get what you want, but it doesn't last. So again, we suffer even with those things that we think we want, or that we think will make our life that much better. So, can we then, as part of our practice, and I would say a necessary part of our practice, can we explore our suffering? Can we embrace it? Can we see what it might teach us? And I think I would argue the answer is that we need to do that. That's an important part of our spiritual path. I'm going to just digress for a moment and tell a story. And I tell this story to give you a sense of the sort of trajectory of suffering and how it gets visited on our parents, and then they visit it on us, and then we visit it on our kids, and on down the line, unless we make a concerted effort to interrupt that cycle and to interrupt that pattern. So this is a story about a family, and I'll just start with the World War II generation, if you will. So the soon-to-be mother of this family is a young woman who is from Louisiana. She grew up very privileged. Her family had very deep roots in Louisiana. Goes back to a land grant by the King of Spain to her ancestors, 1,000 acres, which eventually became a very profitable plantation where sugarcane was raised and where 500 slaves were owned. And so by the time things get to her, she's 19, she's very privileged, very entitled, very spoiled would be another word to describe her. On the other side, we have the person who will be the father in this family, and he is from his grandfather came from Germany and settled in Detroit around the turn of the 20th century, and never learned to speak English. And this man had brought his wife with him. They had 4 daughters and a son, and the son was this man's father. And this man's father married a woman, an American woman, and turns out she was a severe chronic alcoholic, drank her whole life. And they had 1 child. And he graduated from high school in about 1937, I think, and got out of there as quickly as he could, went south, went to Duke University, graduated there, I think, in 42 or 43, and then immediately went into the naval, it's the middle of the war, went into officer training for the Navy. And as part of his, the bulk of his training, he was stationed in New Orleans, where this young woman lives. So we've got I forget how this goes, either a second or a third generation German immigrant, and then we have this woman who's really part of what they used to call the Louisiana aristocracy, just steeped in all of that implies, and all the suffering that implies, I should add. So one Sunday afternoon, the young ladies, proper young ladies of New Orleans society are having a tea at the ballroom in the Pontchartrain Hotel for the young naval officers to be. That's their war effort. They're going to offer tea and comfort to these young men getting ready to go off to fight the Second World War. So these two people meet at this tea, and apparently sparks fly. I wasn't there, but that's what I understand. And but he's getting ready to ship out. So she's 19, he's 22, I think, 23. She goes home and tells her father, I'm going to marry this guy I just met, and he goes ballistic. He just goes crazy. This is not the plan. He's not our kind of people. So, long story short, he ships to San Francisco because he's getting ready to go to be the captain of a landing craft to land Marines in some of the islands that are being contested by the Japanese. And so off he goes. So she, defying her father, convinced her mother to ride the train from New Orleans to San Francisco, which they did, much to the chagrin of the grandfather. Sorry. I was wondering if I could pull that off or not. The grandfather. And they get married, they have a honeymoon, and off he goes to fight the war. And she comes back. This grandfather never, ever spoke to his son-in-law, never acknowledged him, never allowed him to visit in his home. This woman and her eventual children would go every year to Mardi Gras. It was a big deal down there, but he was never invited. So it was a pretty contentious thing. And the reality of it was, and this grandfather, this woman's father, he knew better than anyone that this was a marriage that was doomed. I mean, this marriage happened because of the urgency of war, the heat of the moment. You know, these people didn't even know each other. They're young. Everybody's frantic about the war, and these people should never have ended up together. It was like oil and water. So that sort of begins the context or the background for the suffering that will follow. Well, the suffering's already there in each of them for reasons that I alluded to. So he comes back, the war's over, he comes back, a wife he hardly knows, and a daughter, a little baby, that was born while he was in the South Pacific, and decides he'll go back to school, to law school, hates that, quits, gets a job as a public relations officer in a large corporation. It's sort of like Mad Men, if you've seen that show. That was that era, cocktails every night before dinner and sometimes several cocktails. So, and then they have a son born around 1948, and then another son born in 1950, and then a fourth child, another son in 1957. But by then, in 1954, he very precipitously quits his job and decides to go to seminary, to become an Episcopal priest. But he's got 3 kids and a wife at home, and he's now a student with no income. So this woman, who is very privileged and spoiled, this didn't sit well with her at all. This was not a happy time, apparently. And as it turns out, apparently there was a wealthy patron in the church to which they belonged that basically supported this family, this young family, while the father went off to seminary for 3 years. So, and this was not a life that this woman aspired to. I mean, his salary took a huge, going from being a corporate executive to being a beginning minister. It was, I think, probably cut his salary by 2/3. Anyway, not to belabor this, but so there we are. There's the family. And it's a family that I like the analogy of a used car that's been to the detailer. I mean, this car shines, the hubcaps sparkle. It's just gorgeous sitting on the used car lot. But if you open the hood, it is a disaster. It won't start. Everything's broken. The cables are all out of whack. It's a mess. Because neither of these people had a clue about parenting. Neither of them had a clue about raising children. The father is a very affable, personable, outgoing guy. His congregation loves him. But he's incapable of any kind of real intimacy. He's incapable of connecting. He's sort of like nobody's home, you know. He comes home, he locks himself in his study. He's pretty absent. And this young woman has no real idea about what it is to be a parent. You know, she was raised by nannies, and she just, you know, she's winging it. And it's kind of a big inconvenience to her. She's not really loving this gig. Just giving an example. So if one of the children would fall down and skin their knee, rather than sort of comfort them, she'd get angry because by their doing that, they had upset her. They had ruined her day by skinning their knee. So they would, you know, that was kind of her idea of parenting. So anyway, that's the context. And so the suffering then comes to the kids, and at least one of these kids is feeling isolated, lonely, doesn't have a clue what's going on, but he figures it out. And the secret to this will be if you're perfect and you get straight A's and you look perfectly groomed and your hair's combed and your teeth are brushed and you go off to school and the teacher sends home good comments, then you will finally have cracked the code and you will get the attention and the nurturance that you so desperately long for. So this kid works his butt off right up till puberty. And puberty hits like a vengeance. And this kid realizes, at least in hindsight, that he is furious about this. It's like, what was this deal? I inferred from these parents that if he has to be perfect in order to get what he longs for. And it's been 12, 13 years and it hadn't happened. So the wheels come off this kid's life at this point. I mean, he just breaks bad. And it's one of those situations where the suffering is immense. And so there's just this very painful adolescence, lots of acting out. Another story which I won't share with you except to say that it involved a moment of grace when there was a teacher who saw this kid for whom the wheels had come off and saw the extent of his suffering and intervened with him in a way that really changed the trajectory of his life in many ways. So, back to suffering with that as a context. So, I go to church, I do what I think I'm supposed to do, and it's just not working. The suffering's just still running strong. It's still there. And I'm searching. I'm searching for some path, some way, some means. You know, it didn't turn out to be drugs. It didn't turn out to be, a hippie lifestyle. It didn't turn out to be the church. Looked at other traditions. That wasn't really doing it. But lo and behold, at some point I hear about this path called Buddhism. And all of a sudden, almost immediately upon learning some of what the basics were, there's now a context with which I could understand my suffering. First time in my life, I was like, holy cow. And this is after some significant psychotherapy, which was immensely helpful, but the suffering is still somewhat unabated in certain parts. So now there's a context, and this is like the clouds parting. I mean, this was a major event in terms of seeing that there was a path that made sense of this, that with which you could understand the suffering, and with which, if you walk that path, you might get some relief from that suffering. It was just one of those phenomenal lightning bolt kinds of moments. And as I thought about it, and I was thinking about the talk, it occurred to me that a word that we don't hear a whole lot in this practice, which is faith. I mean, Sharon Salzberg wrote a book 5 or 8 years ago called Faith, but faith usually is associated with Christianity or other religions where you have faith in the deity or faith in the afterlife or whatever. But it occurred to me, what about faith in the three refuges? What about faith in the Buddha as a role model, as someone we would aspire to be, or our own Buddha nature? What about faith in that to transform our lives for the better? What about faith in the Dharma, the teachings, as a way of further transforming our life? What about faith in the Sangha, the community? Because I know without that faith, there were really some difficult times where I probably would have just veered off the path. It wasn't, those dark moments, that we all have, those dips in terms of the trajectory of our lives. But to have the faith in the refuges, I think, can really carry us through those times if we allow it. And that's part of embracing our suffering because we have faith that there's a way out of our suffering. That's the argument for why I think suffering can be such an effective teacher. It was without the faith, knowing that I could survive if I opened to my suffering, if I really leaned into it, if I really embraced it. I needed the faith that this stuff worked enough that I could do that and survive that. Just by beginning to open to that. And I should say, just parenthetically, one P.S. about the story, lest you think I hate my parents, which I did for many years. Once I, through the practice, was able to see the extent to which my clinging and grasping after wanting them to be other than who they were capable of being because of their own causes and conditions. Once I could let go of my grasping that, why weren't you this way? Why weren't you this way? You betrayed me. You betrayed my siblings. And saw that their suffering was immense. Then I could open to some compassion for them. And when my father died in 2008, unfortunately I didn't come to this till after he died, but nonetheless it came and it just provided a tremendous opening of my heart for them and able to focus on some of the good stuff, some of the gifts that they gave all of us in terms of, values and how to be in the world and how to be, interpersonally and so forth and so on. So, that was sort of the PS to that story. And I think that's been a real revelation as well in terms of alleviating a big chunk of suffering, which was predicated on my anger and at both of them. So, and as I said, once I developed the faith that my suffering, if I turned toward it, wouldn't kill me, I could begin to lean into it. I could begin to embrace it. And out of that came some clarity, really clarity of my experience, some understanding for the first time in my life about this, a sense of equanimity about things that I really can't change, clarity about what's really true for all of us, what is the truth of our lives, the clarity of that. So what exactly does it mean to be present with our suffering? Well, it means, for one thing, not to see it as bad or wrong. Not to, I grew up as perhaps many of you did, where if something was wrong or we suffered, then there's something bad about that, or you should feel ashamed of your suffering. You should hide your suffering. That's part of the used car that's all shiny but all torn up inside. Is you don't want anybody to see the scratches. And so turning toward the dukkha, turning toward the suffering, to open to it, to embrace it in all the ways that it exists in our lives. And we all have our own story, and we all have suffering in our families and in our lives and in our parents and right down the line. But the other thing that opening to the suffering did, it created, and we were talking about this in one of the groups this morning, it enlarged the context. It created a spaciousness around it. It wasn't so contracted. It wasn't so tight. It was expansive. It was open, where you could breathe. You weren't holding your breath. You could open to it in a more spacious way. We all have plenty of dukkha in our lives, but can we meet it? Can we open it? Can we befriend it? That's our challenge. The other thing that I think comes from opening to it, opening to the dukkha, to the suffering, is that wisdom begins to develop. We cultivate wisdom out of that. Things start to make sense. There's a clarity. It's like, oh, okay, this is how things are. And these things I can't do anything about, so okay. And this too, and this too. That mantra about, well, this is the way things are. And as I was saying about my parents a moment ago, we can develop the wisdom that can come with letting go of clinging to our wanting things to be a certain way. Once we let go of trying to control that, trying to make it work for us, and we open to the fact that, we can't. Stuff happens. There's a tremendous freedom, I think, that comes with being able to do that. Now, that said, it's an active process. We can't sit around and wait for it to happen. We have to go after it. We have to reach for it. We have to open to it. Oh, there's suffering. I'm not going to run and hide. I'm not going to go shopping or go to the bar or do whatever. I'm going to sit with it. I'm going to be with it. I'm going to let it bubble up and look at it and see try it on. This is Pema Chodron. She says, whatever you're experiencing, don't try to make it go away. Working with adverse circumstances, not avoiding them or trying to distract myself from them has helped me to wake up more in my life, to be there more for other people, and to be happier. And it's exactly what she's talking about. I think two things happen, at least two things, maybe more, when we embrace our suffering. The first, it begins to reduce our own suffering by acceptance, by the letting go, by opening to it. But secondly, and perhaps as importantly, it reduces the suffering of those around us who are subjected to our unskillful means that's a function of our suffering. So and my wife will tell you this, I'm a much nicer guy to live with than I used to be. I used to be a kind of a real controlling pain in the ass, and she would tell you that too. But so we not only suffer less ourselves, I think those around us suffer less by the fact that it spreads out. This is also from the Buddha, from the middle-length discourses. He says, by protecting oneself, one protects others. By protecting others, one protects oneself. So he's really talking about that kind of shared benefit, I think. In AA, they talk about, in AA, all the 12-step programs, they talk about hitting a bottom. And I think what that means in another way is really coming face to face with one's suffering, really just right here. I'm not going to keep running away from it. You work with people in recovery, they talk about all the ways they run away from their suffering. And you hit that bottom, and all of a sudden, boom, there it is. And then they start the healing process. And as I said earlier, without the suffering in my life, which took many forms, it really drew me to this path, to this practice. It just clicked. The tradition in which I was raised, it never really spoke to me or offered me relief. I tried to make it work. I have other family members for whom it worked, but it wasn't working for me. I wasn't willing to gamble on the fact that maybe the next life will be better, because I wasn't convinced that there was a next life. So I figured I better try to get my act together this time around. But I think the thing that I most resonated with most deeply was the Buddha's teaching on suffering, and how it really speaks to us about what goes on in our lives. It's not just a bunch of theory. It's not an abstraction. It's really where the rubber meets the road. He laid it out incredibly clearly. One of the ways we suffer is and the other teachers have talked about it this weekend, is separation. Pat talks about that a lot. We suffer from isolation, from separation. And I think in the West particularly, we feel guilty and ashamed when we suffer. We feel defective. We aren't meeting that Western ideal of perfection. And as a result, we don't want people to get close. I don't want you to find out that I'm really, underneath this facade, I'm really struggling, and I'm really damaged, and I'm really suffering. And that just exacerbates the isolation and the aloneness. But if you then take that and look at the teachings and bring the teachings to that, again, I think it can really begin to let go of some of that. Just a sense of self-compassion that Sharon did a beautiful self-compassion today. I did one yesterday. It really starts with that, I think, of, okay, I've got to open my heart to my own suffering. My heart has to quiver, as Pat says, to my own suffering, for starters. And I began to delve into these teachings and listen to Dharma talks, and it was as though this just spoke to me in a way that nothing else ever has and never will, I don't think. And I knew I was home spiritually. It's like, this is where I need to be. This is my path. So again, I think our suffering can point us toward compassion, not just for ourselves, but for others. It's really the way we open our heart, is by acknowledging that suffering, feeling it, embracing it. I think that out of suffering, and this, you've probably heard this, this is not obviously, it's almost a cliche, but out of suffering is compassion develops. It's like you have to sort of put the iron in the fire, and then the steel gets hard from the suffering, from the fire. I've always felt that people that are really compassionate have accepted and embraced their own suffering and are really able to work with it. I think that makes for I think some of the best therapists I've known were people who brought tremendous suffering of their own to the profession, because they really get it. They really get what, I was thinking as I was thinking about the talk about the massive amounts of suffering in our world, and just over the course of my career, the suffering that I saw every day. It's just, it's amazing that human beings can endure what they endure. You may have heard this from Thich Nhat Hanh. He says, "No mud, no lotus." And I love that. And I think what he means is that because suffering can feel so bad, we try to run away from it with all the ways we try to avoid it. We try to watch too much TV or get online too much or eat too much, all the things I spoke of earlier. But he says that unless we're able to face it, we can't be present and available to life right now, here in this moment. And that happiness will continue to elude us because we're not facing it. We're not standing, in the fire, if you will. He goes on to say, we can be in touch with suffering without being overwhelmed by it. When we know how to suffer, we suffer much, much less. I'm remembering another quote from Pema Chodron that I spoke of in an earlier talk in our Sangha, and she talked about when the suffering seems too great, we just touch into it. We don't go full force into it. We nibble at it a little bit. Intolerable bites. And I love that, because she was saying, yeah, you gotta get into it, but you don't have to just lay yourself open. Nibble at it a little bit and then work your way into it more deeply. I think it's just a brilliant, brilliant teaching from both her and Thich Nhat Hanh. So the reflection that we did yesterday on compassion, really trying to locate a source of suffering in our own life and then opening to it by using, how others see us, or using how we might have seen ourselves as children suffering. I think that's a good way. I think all the ways that Sharon delineated this afternoon in her guided heart meditation about compassion are incredibly powerful ways of cultivating that, of cultivating it both in terms of our own suffering and that of others. Moving that compassion toward ourselves, keeping the heart open, being kind to ourselves. Ajahn Sumedho, the Buddhist monk, says that to truly understand suffering, we must be willing to stand under suffering. Sort of the image of a shower where you're just going to stand under it and let it get you wet. And he's pointing here to our capacity to fully and consciously meet life as it is, as it really truly is, not as we want it to be, but right there again, right where it is. Because we all know that we suffer when life is not as we want it to be. That someone said this morning, the difference between, if I get this right, expectation and reality, that therein lies a lot of suffering. Here's my expectations. Here's the way it is. Boy, I'm not happy about that. If I can acknowledge how it is, then my suffering's going to diminish. And you know this, but again, this path gives us clear methods to address this, to address the suffering in our lives, to help us open to the suffering in the world with an open heart. You know, I should mention a caveat here, which is, you know, you must know people like this, but folks who, and perhaps we've all suffered from this, I'm sure I have at times, sort of make suffering a virtue. You know, the martyr thing. Oh, you won't believe the day I had. It was hard. You know. You know, where our suffering gets fused with our ego. So it's all about, you know, people actually are used to use the term clinically of the empty narcissist, the idea being that it was that person who was very self-absorbed, but self-absorbed in their suffering. They weren't grandiose in the sense of a sort of grandiose narcissist. They were more, they suffered better than anyone else. That was their narcissism. You may know, I love this short story by Kafka, The Hunger Artist. Do you know that story? It's wonderful. I recommend it. It's pretty short. There's a number of translations. But it's the story of this man who, he's a performance artist, and his performance is, you go into the theater, there's a cage there in which he sits, and he starves himself. That's what he does. That's his act. And he starves himself better than anybody else can do it. And he's amazing at this. And that's his claim to fame, that he suffers better than anybody else. And it just makes that point so clearly how one can make, in this case, clearly become a martyr, make suffering a virtue, make it something that they're so proud of. And I won't give away the ending, but it's worth reading if you want to track it down. Okay. All right, so this talk actually was not completed. I was working on it for our song at Charlottesville in a couple of weeks, so if you see I'm on deck, you may not want to come that night if you've already heard it. So I'll just warn you that you'll hear the same talk, because it's still in the formative stages. But I wanted to close with a poem by Diana Falls. You may know her. She writes beautiful poetry, and this one's called "Allow." She says, "There is no controlling life. Try corralling a lightning bolt containing a tornado. Dam a stream and it will create a new channel. Resist and the tide will sweep you off your feet. Allow and grace will carry you to higher ground. The only safety lies in letting it all in. The wild with the weak, fear, fantasies, failures, and success. When loss rips off the doors of your heart, or sadness veils your vision with despair, practice becomes simply bearing the truth. In the choice to let go of your known way of being, the whole world is revealed to your new eyes." So let's sit for a moment. May all beings be free from suffering. May all beings be free from suffering. May all beings be free from suffering. Thank you.